Hello all, Pepe here. Before the full compilation begins, I wanted to share a VR story. If you have a story that you wish to share, you can add me as a friend on Discord. My name is Pepe's Choice, all lowercase, no spaces, no punctuation. I have no plans to make a community Discord, seeing as those attract weirdos, power trippers, and other undesirable Discord inhabitants. Another big reason is the fate of other green text Discords, which have either been deleted or repeatedly deal with obnoxious drama nonsense. Anyway, thanks for watching, and on to the view story. Hopefully you guys can help me solve this. I went to a university in Pennsylvania outside of Philadelphia. I will leave it up to you what one you think it is. It was a Catholic university, so I never expected to see anything odd there ever of the paranormal sort. This university had woods near it and a good amount to boot, and two cemeteries near it, one being close to campus and one across the parking lot from the cafeteria. The one close to campus is important to the story as a nearby landmark. The second would be the road nearby that leads to a gate. This road is important to the second sighting. The first time I saw this was on Legion RD. There is a small fenced-in area with a small building. I saw something gray at first that looked like a rock or stump. Even though I was in the car, I could see it looked like something sitting on the ground with its back to me. If you had Gollum from Lord of the Rings sit on the ground with his legs pulled against his chest, this is what it looked like to me. The second event happened at night while on a ghost hunt the school had. We went outside and I remember it being windy and cold. We left from the back entrance to the main building and walked to a spot near a landscaped area with a trellis. We talked about where to go and started walking. The one cemetery mentioned before as a landmark is to the left of this spot across a road. I remember us going right from where we stood toward the road that lead to the gate. It was in front of us. I saw this gray humanoid looking creature run parallel to us and go down near the road before I lost sight of it. It was night, so I know it was gray, but what shade honestly I am not sure. I would say slate gray. Size would be about 4 feet tall, perhaps it was hunched a little while walking, so this is an estimate. I looked far and wide for anything similar to this after the event happened and found nothing. The only thing like it was the rake story, and that's fictional. Has anyone else seen anything like this? Pardon any spelling mistakes, I did this all on my phone. Provided are 2 drawings of what was seen. Pepe again, onto the main compilation. What is a supernatural event that happened in your life that just cannot be explained? I don't know if I'd call it supernatural, but it was freaky and I still don't understand. I was in the kitchen cleaning up waiting for my kid's bus. I saw it pull up, and saw him get off. He didn't come in, but he'd started playing around with hiding under the window to jump out at me and say boo, so I thought that's what he was doing. But I walked out and he wasn't there. I called his name, and looked around the house thinking he was hiding from me, but I couldn't find him. I circled the house calling for him, and the parent panic set in. It probably only lasted 90 seconds, but it felt a lot longer. Then his bus pulled up and he got off.
I've never encountered another person with the same kind of story as mine. I've looked and looked for years regarding accounts or folklore regarding the ghosts of living people. Here's my story. We were about 13, my best friend and I. She lived in the second story of an apartment building with her mom at the time. After playing indoors, we decided to go outside. As soon as we stepped outside, her in front of me, I said, "Oh, it's so cold," and I let the door slightly ajar to grab my coat off the couch. Then turning around, we ran back outside together. I stopped at the door to put on my coat, but she kept running to the end of the balcony where the stairs were that led to an empty parking lot, trying to be sneaky and scare her. I snuck up behind her as she quietly looked over the railing. When I got about 3 feet away from her, she quickly turned around, smiled and darted around the corner down the stairs. I laughed and chased after her, only I thought it was odd how quickly she got down the stairs and found a place to hide. The stairs led to an empty parking lot. She was nowhere to be found. Confused, I circled back up to the stairs on the opposite end of the lot, These stairs were the only other way up to the second floor, and an apartment complex length down the way. As I made my way across, up, and back to her apartment without seeing her, I open her apartment door and at the same time she is walking back out. Immediately I was thinking, WTF, how? I said, how did you get back inside so fast? She said, what do you mean? I went in right behind you, to get my coat too. She went on to explain that she agreed when I said it was cold and went back in with me to grab a coat from her room. I made her swear on everything sacred to her at the moment, and even periodically until this day, besties over 20 years, that it was not her at the top of the stairs that day.
I had a phase in my mid-teens when I would read the obituaries in the local newspaper. I saw a name that was familiar as it was the same as a family friend. It had his full first, middle, and last names. I didn't say anything to my parents since I figured they already knew. A few days later my mom told me he died and I said I knew since I saw his obit. She said, he died last night in his sleep. I went back through the newspapers. My mom kept them for a week before throwing them out, but the obit wasn't there. When the real obit came out it had his first and last name but just his middle initial. This was almost 40 years ago and I still think about it.
I shared this story a few times on Reddit but no one seems to care. I just wish I could show people firsthand how bizarre it really was. There's this place in my hometown called Old Town, which is an area they had to evacuate because a mine was there and it made the area unsafe due to sinkholes and whatnot. I was in a class in middle school called Environmental Adventures where you did outdoor stuff and we went to Old Town to do some geocaching. While the class was walking we saw an old lady on a rocking chair on a concrete foundation where a house used to be. She was dressed like an old-timey old lady like Muriel from Courage the Cowardly Dog. She was rocking back and forth, talking to herself while she stared into the woods, not looking at us once. We found the geocache a little down the road, turned around in her and the rocking chair disappeared. There was no way that she could have got away that fast toting a rocking chair without us seeing her. We were only at the geocache for like 5 minutes. Confused everybody. Weirdest shit ever.
Woke up to a weird feeling, and saw an opaque silhouette of a little boy standing on the other side of the apartment facing me. I turned on my light and it was gone. When I turned my light off I saw it again. Flipped the light back on and went over there to make sure there was nothing that could be causing a weird shadow, etc. There was nothing there that could have created that specific shape and it was standing in the pathway between my couch and wall, so it couldn't have been a shadow. I turned my light off again and it was there, flipped it back on and slept with the light on for the rest of the night. Couldn't sleep without the light on for days, lol.
Was biking down a country road I used to live on. I think I was 8 or 9. And on my way home I saw this small humanoid looking being run across the road, from one crop field into a cornfield. The only details I could make out, and I still vividly remember, was that it was completely covered in yellow, from neck to feet, and I think it has green on its head. I told my mom about it and all she could come up with was something about Cabbage Patch Kids. Never saw that thing again, but I still think about it from time to time. Edit, it was the size of a small child, about 50 feet away.
My cousin had struggled with depression his whole life, and a few years ago things came to a head. He was 100% convinced the only cure to his depression was suicide, that death was the only thing that would make him truly happy. We were close, so it hit pretty hard. After the funeral, my aunt told us that she had saw a helium-filled smiley face balloon kind of float in front of her, then stop, and it just kinda sat there for a minute. Then it flew up and away, out of sight, on its own. When she told us this we kind of just brushed it off as a coincidence, but it kept happening to her over the next couple weeks. We thought she was just recognizing patterns, until I was at a music festival a few months later and the exact same type of balloon, same color, and everything, flowed through my campsite, and did the same thing where it stopped on its own, stared at me, then kind of bobbed and flew up and away. I'm not really a believer in ghosts and the like, but I'm convinced in some shape or form that was my cousin telling us that he was finally happy.
Early into my now wife and I's relationship, I had a dream about her in childbirth. Very vivid and long. Like I spent days in the hospital with her and everything was in a strange twilight. When it came time to deliver, things went very wrong and she and baby ended up passing away. I woke up quite shook naturally but brushed it off. I am a nurse and have had to deal with traumatic OB situations before, and I chalked it up to me dealing with that stress through a dream. 6 years later and my wife is pregnant. I have forgotten the dream by now. I get a call late into the 3rd trimester while I am on shift. Wife is going to the ER for a bad BP. I get off my shift and go to meet her. As soon as I step into the room I remember my dream. It's the same damn room. Which is extra spooky because the hospital we were at wasn't even built when I had the dream. This is last year, right when lockdown started. My wife has admitted they want to wait a week to deliver if possible. She will be kept in a twilight state until that time. So it's me in this room eerily isolated as the world around us is frozen and my wife is incoherent mere feet away. Lingering for days in this room I brushed off my dream, trying to manage my anxiety and stress. Come showtime my wife gets ready to begin pushing and it's exactly the same scenario as my dream. Things start going poorly, but the doctor thinks delivery is still possible, but at this point I finally freak out into full panic, and demand a C-section for my wife. The DR. I can tell wants to argue but I think my outburst made her step back and reassess the situation and she made the call for emergency C-section. Took 10 minutes for me to get taken back and as I'm in the OR I see my baby come out lifeless. They do everything they can and manage to resuscitate her. In the meantime my wife is doing poorly and they are scrambling to control her bleeding. I follow the baby out knowing there's really nothing I can do. Baby gets life flight to another hospital, but before we go I see my wife stable and headed to the ICU. Both my wife and baby are critical but alive. Today they are both thriving and my baby is 16 months and just a tornado of energy. I don't know that they would be alive if not for that dream and it causing me to freak out and demand a change in plan.
I have too. One day, about 20 years ago, I came home from work to find my dad dead on the sofa. He was cold to the touch, but I still called 911 and tried to resuscitate him in case there was any chance that I was wrong. My grandparents lived down the street. Their house was always the gathering place. People came for a cup of coffee every day. My dad had suffered some brain injuries a few years prior, but had fully recovered and got sober, so his death was pretty unexpected. He was only 48. When the ambulance came roaring down the street, my grandmother said something along the lines of, "I hope that's not going to my son's house." My uncle was in the kitchen at the time and said, "Nah, your son is at the door." He had seen my dad looking for the window next to the door. Of course, he was gone by that time. Still gives me chills. The other one is not nearly as dramatic. My wife and I lived next to a golf course. One morning we were leaving at around 5 a.m. A golf cart with 2 guys crossed in front of us. Not dangerously close, but close. We remarked that it was pretty early for people to be out. I had never seen anyone out that early in the few years that I had lived there. I looked over to my left, and they were nowhere to be seen. This was a very open parking lot. We stopped and looked back, but no trace of any golf cart or anyone in general. Thanks for attending my long-winded ghost conference. There are refreshments in the lobby.
My dad killed my mom when I was 10. I'm now mid-30s. 2 years ago I had lost my wedding ring. We looked everywhere. I even played back the security camera at work to see if I was wearing it when I left. I gave up finding it and was very upset. One night I had a dream my mom woke me up and said, "I know you've been looking for this. I love you. It'll be out here." In the morning I was getting ready for work as usual, sat down on the couch. Right in front of me on the ottoman was my ring. I went to bed after my wife and she woke up after me. I used that ottoman the night before and there's no way the ring could have been there. Again, I checked our camera. We had been robbed once, so we kept a camera towards the front door. It could see our couch, and the ottoman had no ring when I went to bed. I still cry every now and then remembering it.
Many years ago, my parents had separated and my father was planning on taking a trip across the country to California. He was pretty excited about it. I talked to him the day before he's leaving, wish him well and tell him I'll talk to him after he gets to California. The day of his trip, he calls me and tells me he decided last minute not to go. Refuses to really get into why. Just says he changed his mind. Seemed really odd for something that he had been planning for a couple months. That night I'm sitting at my girlfriend's house and we're watching the news, and they report that US Air Flight 1493, the flight my dad was supposed to be on, collided with another aircraft while landing in Los Angeles. About 25% of the people on the flight were killed. Hard to know how my dad would have made out, because it really depended on where you were sitting, front versus back of the plane. It was several months before he finally told me that night before he was supposed to leave, he had an extremely vivid dream that he died in a fiery plane crash. So vivid that it scared him out of flying that day. My dad is a Marine Corps Vietnam veteran who saw combat. I can only imagine how vivid the dream must have been, to scare him out of getting on that plane that morning. Edit, believe it or not, I've never actually watched Final Destination. Now I have to see it.
Super minor compared to many in this thread. Night before Thanksgiving 3 years ago, I was across the country at my parents', driving back to theirs with my now wife from a friend's house. As we draw near, there is some type of bundle in the middle of the road. I stopped and pulled off to move it, and it turned out to be a barred owl that got clipped by a car. Long story short, I spent the rest of that night getting the owl into a puppy cage, gave it some food and water, and the next day dropped it off at a wildlife rescue center. I got home the next week, all the way across the country, New Jersey to Oregon. I stepped outside and there was a barred owl sitting on my fence watching me. It was gone by the time I got back. But now I know I'm straight with all owls.
My buddy and I were playing tennis one night at some courts by my house. Lights usually went out at 11, but for whatever reason that night they went off at a weird time, like 10:43. Whatever, that was weird. We collected our stuff and started walking to my car about 500 feet from the courts. My buddy's mom pulls up right as we're getting to my car and goes, "Where the hell have you been? I called your cell and some guy was just laughing, it didn't sound like you." It was then my buddy realized he didn't have his phone on him. He told his mom to call his cell again and we could see it light up in the middle of the court we were playing on, by the net, but still definitely in between the single lines, not at all where we kept the rest of our stuff. He goes and gets it and only has the one missed call from his mom, the one she just made. He asked if she called the right number and her call log showed 3 calls to his phone all that night. We can't explain why the cell was on the court or what happened with the calls or what happened with the lights. It was surreal.
Went with my brother to see an old family property my mother had inherited in a really rural area. We were just looking about, it hadn't been lived in for decades. A bit of wind, a bit of a rainy day, and both me and my brother were inspecting the house until we started hearing a weird rhythmic knock coming from around the building. Just a knock at regular intervals, much like a clock sounds, but a lot louder. We stepped out to look around, but the noise started sounding like it was getting further away from us, until it disappeared. We left shortly afterwards. A couple of days go by, and I stopped by my mother's. I ask her if she has any pictures of the original owner of the house, which was her grandfather, so my great-grandfather. She pulled it out. Guess what? The man had a wooden leg as a result of a war injury. Told my mother all about it and it was like she was remembering him. She says that's exactly how it sounded when he walked on the porch. Weird AF. Edit, it's possible it was a bird tapping on wood somewhere around, but as far as I know birds that do this tend to tap in a very rapid fashion. In my story above, the knocks were about 2 seconds or so apart, quite a bit different from how an animal usually behaves. I'm not into supernatural stuff, but damn, that was eerie. This didn't happen to me, but a very nice old man and his wife used to live a few streets over from us. Well, she got very sick and his son flew in to help watch and care for her. A few weeks later she moved to hospice and later died. The night she died, her husband and son drive home and they were talking about what to do for the funeral, and the husband asked, "Do you think she'd want some person to attend, and they both said they heard the dead mom/wife in the back seat say no thank you. Not a very big one, but here we go. Once when I was 13, I had an incredibly vivid dream. Beautiful colors, sunny skies, anyways, part of the dream there were these two bulls fighting in my house. The fighting was about as scary as a children's book antagonist. I shooed them out and went on my merry way. After waking up, I got ready for school and my mom started driving to town. Out in the distance, I saw two bulls fighting. In the 9 years of living there, that's the only time I saw it. I know my story's pretty minor, but I still wonder about it.
I have an idea of what may have happened, but I cannot definitively say how this happened. My father died in 2000 in my parents' house. I was over one night pretty late after my mother had gone to sleep. I swear I could feel my father's presence, as I was right in the spot where he had died. They believe he had a heart attack while laying on the couch, tried to get off the couch to call for help but fell on the floor and died, though no one else was home when it happened. I was on the couch when this happened. Anyway, I thought to myself, this is stupid. People don't leave essences behind, I'm not feeling anything. So, I say out loud, if this is really you, Dad, knock a box of cereal off the shelf onto the floor. I wanted to pick something I didn't think could happen by accident. I went into the kitchen and watched the shelf with the cereal on it for a few minutes and nothing happened. Since it was almost midnight, I decided to sleep in my old bedroom. I woke up the next morning and went downstairs and a box of cereal was laying on the floor. I say to my mother, "Did you knock that cereal onto the floor?" She said no, it was like that when she woke up. So, what the fuck, man? However, my mother had a cat. I'm guessing the cat did it, but I don't know for sure. If she'd gotten on the shelf, everything would have been knocked around and messy from her. Everything else was in its normal position, just the box of cereal was on the floor. I mean, regardless, it has to have been the cat, right? Edit, my mother also told me, months before this happened, that she felt my father get in bed with her one night after he died. She said, "Go away, Greg. You're dead. You don't need to go to bed anymore," and she says she felt him get out of the bed after that. Weird. My mother despised my father by the end of his life, though they remained married. It's not surprising she told him to GTFO.
I have, quite a few actually. But one that happened pretty recently stands out. I grew up in a very rural area. Mostly crop farms everywhere. About a mile from my parents' house, there was this old abandoned farmhouse that all the area kids said was haunted. They would sneak into the house after dark, all the typical stupid kid crap, but I believe there are things in this world better left alone and never went. Years pass, the house fell into disrepair and was eventually torn down, leaving an old weathered barn. Well, I make a little side money selling photos of abandoned places, so I wanted to take a picture of the barn. I parked on the road and was walking up the drive. I made it about 10 feet before I just could not walk any further. My feet wouldn't move forward, my adrenaline spiked and I burst into tears. So I turned back and ran to my car. I didn't feel safe until I got past a nearby creek you have to cross to get there. I let it go, but a few months later we had to drive past the property after having Christmas dinner with my parents, and there was a creature standing in the drive. It reminded me of the faun from Pan's Labyrinth, just super tall with a wide head and horns or antlers, but the eyes were more on the side of the head. Again adrenaline kicked in and I burst into tears, but I was trying to keep it together because I didn't want to freak out my kids. My husband asked if I was okay. I just said, "You saw that, right?" "Yep." "Was it human?" "Nope." I refused to drive that road ever again.
Not me, but my mother. She tells two stories. One time her doctor changed her blood pressure meds. It caused her to pass out on the kitchen floor. She had a near-death experience that's similar to what a lot of people described, the tunnel of light, dead family members coming to see her, incredible feeling of joy, etc. My uncle, her brother, was maybe 10 years older than her. Back in the 60s, he had a boat and used to take it from Florida to the Bahamas. It was a trip he had made many times. One day he left in the boat and vanished. A short time after, she was at work, and her phone rang. It was a woman. "Is this Carol?" "Yes. I just wanted you to know that your brother died an honorable death." Then the woman hung up.
I was out with my parents, and it was late coming back home. At around 2:30 a.m. we were at a traffic signal. A homeless guy comes and knocks on the window of the seat where my mother was sitting. As she rolled down the window to give him money, he said, "Check what is happening at your brother's house." He proceeded to take the money and walked away. Probably thinking that he was a bit crazy in the head, we didn't bother and went home. Next morning mom gets a call from her brother's wife. He has had a heart attack. At 2:30 a.m.
When I was a kid, about 10-12-ish, I was carrying a load of laundry upstairs home alone while mom was out doing errands. We have this weird carpet runner over our hardwood stairs that's only really attached at the top of the flight but otherwise not fitted or secured to each individual stair, so naturally I step on an air bubble of carpet with my vision obscured by the laundry and fall backwards while bear hugging a bunch of blankets. I specifically remember thinking, "Welp, guess I'm about to die," while almost airborne with just my big toe left on the carpet when I felt two hands, one on either side of my shoulder blades, give me a firm shove that launched me back up on the step and diagonally against the stair rail. I assumed mom somehow silently came back early without announcing herself and turned around to thank her while still clinging to the railing, but no one was there. I scurried upstairs to put my things down while calling her name and walked the house afterwards to check if any doors were unlocked or if her car was there. I finally resorted to calling her cell where she told me she was hitting up a few more stores. It still feels like there's a presence on that stairwell, like someone's watching, but in a protective way rather than sinisterly.
We had a stair ghost too. When my mom was heavily pregnant, she used to sit in front of the fire in the den with the dogs at her feet. One night, both dogs jerked awake and proceeded to watch someone climb the spiral staircase, but nobody was there. She's pretty sure it was her mom, checking that our bedroom, twins, was ready for us coming, because the dogs were calm, and she said she just felt this really reassuring presence. Fast forward 6-ish years and I woke up one night to find my mom sitting at the end of my bed and basically running a soothing hand up and down my leg. Said to her the next day that it was really nice, or something along those lines. I was young, and she was absolutely terrified because she didn't come into our room. My mom is the spitting image of her mom, so I'm guessing it was my gran soothing me back to sleep.
Oh, I have a stairs ghost in my country house too. We were in bed with my girlfriend one night, and from the bed we have a full view of the top of the staircase. Anyways, we were reading and suddenly we both heard someone running up the wooden stairs. We looked and there was nobody, and we were home alone. I searched the house, it's very small anyway, and it was empty and all doors and windows were locked. The bed is like 5 feet from the stairs, so it's not like we could really confuse anything with the sound of someone running up the stairs anyway. I'm the most Cartesian person I know, so you better believe I have been looking for an explanation for years. I still don't have one.
I have 2 incidents like that. When I was a small child I had no fat on me and dense bones. In water, I would sink like a stone. I also couldn't swim. I was at a pool with no lifeguard. All occupants were in the shallow end. I fell in the deep end and started sinking. I knew I was gonna die. But someone pushed me up and my mom saw my arms flailing. I felt someone push me out as she grabbed me. I turned back to see who saved me, but there was no one. The second experience found me riding my bike. I was 14, with my baby sister, she was 9. I was going pretty fast when she turned in front of me. My bike flipped and I went flying over my sister. I felt hands grab me under my arms. I felt like I floated as I landed on my feet. My little sister looked at me with wide eyes and asked, "How did you do that? You floated in the air." Neither of us have any explanation, but it broke my bike. To this day my sister and I still talk about it. There was no way I should have flown off by bike the way I did, nor could I have launched myself high enough to land on my feet, or as high as my sister said I floated.
I live in a city and my brother lives in another city that is around 1,000 kilometers away. He visits sometimes but not quite often. On an average of once every 2 years. On one day around 7 years ago I was sleeping on the couch in the living room at my apartment. I woke up suddenly on my brother sitting just beside me and I was shocked/surprised, started greeting him and asking him about how is he doing and what pleasant surprise it was. Next thing I realized that this was a dream as the doorbell was ringing, which woke me. Went to open the door and guess what? It was my brother who came to surprise us. This literally had me speechless. Don't have any explanation, and I think sometimes you don't need to have one.
I had a dream once about my high school best friend who had moved out of state and started a family. I hadn't seen her or spoken to her in at least 10 years and had never met her child, except seeing pictures/posts on Facebook and commenting on them. In my dream I was walking down a street at night and out of nowhere her little girl appears next to me and I asked her, "Where is your mama? Why are you by yourself?" I remember her taking me to some bushes near a random house on the street and finding my friend in bad shape, beaten up or something, on the ground, and I remember running to the door of the random house screaming for help and to call the police. This is all I can recall from the dream, but I think there may have been a little more. The next day, I wake up and think to myself, man, that was weird. Maybe I dreamt of her because we had just spoken a little in comments of a Facebook post. I should send her a message. I go on about my day, go to work, get home later that day and sit on my couch and scroll through Facebook. Bam. 1,000 posts, rest in peace, etc., all of them tagged my friend and her daughter. I thought, what in the actual f***ck? At that point there was no information as to what had happened, so I thought it must have been a car accident or something. Over the course of the next few weeks to months, more and more information came out and it was not an accident. My friend and her sweet baby had been murdered by some animal. I won't refer to them as a person. This happened about 5 years ago. I still remember the main parts of the dream vividly. I still am a little horrified that I had this dream that night. When it was happening, possibly. I haven't been able to tell anyone else about it either because just thinking about it gives me chills.
Working as night security for a small office at a sanitation plant. Building was a single entrance and you had to check in at the security station to get in or out. A worker shows up and checks in saying he needs to take care of a few things and grab some stuff. So I check in his ID and flip a few lights for him, then go back about my business. Fast forward a few hours and my shift is about to end. I still haven't seen the guy come back. So I go patrol the building to find him and literally can't find him anywhere. He's not in any of the areas I turned lights on for him, no other lights are on, and he's not in any other rooms. I stop by security to see if we just missed each other and he's trying to leave, but nobody is there. I do a second patrol and still no signs. At this point I went to check cameras to see where he went, but he's not on a single camera except the one covering the entrance and security station. He turns down a hallway and never shows up on the next camera down said hall. At this point I logged it as an incident, and GTFO right as the relief shift showed up. Next day my boss calls me and says that worker had been on vacation out of state for several days, and wouldn't return for several more. Nobody could offer any explanation to what happened.
Back in 2010 my family and I lived in a really nice home out in the woods, and there was always weird things that happened in that home that was unexplainable. One day I was coming up the stairs from my basement, and as I rounded the corner I saw a shadowy figure running up the stairs from the main floor to the top floor. I only saw it from the corner of my eye and the figure was gone in an instant. Fast forward a couple years, I have moved on to college and my parents decided they were going to sell the home to downsize. They had just got done repainting most of the walls, and I asked my cousin if she could take a picture so I could see how the new walls looked. She took the picture in the back of our living facing the front of the house, which just so happened to have the staircase to the right, and in the picture was that same shadow I had seen year prior. She was the only one in the home when the picture was taken, and it looks like the shadow is looking right at you. I have the picture posted in my profile history if anyone wants to see it.
As my great-grandfather passed away, My aunt and uncle had an unopened voicemail on their landline answering machine. As they listened to the voicemail, it sounded exactly like my great-grandpa saying "God help me" before it faded off. The thing that trips me out the most is how my aunt and uncle requested a log of their incoming/outgoing calls, and there were no calls logged in that time frame. I've heard the voicemail. So bananas.
Already posted this a year and a half ago, but I'll go again. I have to make a bit of a premise. When I was little, the woman that came to clean my house, I'll call her Mary, while my parents were working, was also my babysitter. Usually after she ended up cleaning, she would bring me to her house until my mom would come and pick me up. There during the year I knew her whole family. Among these was her husband that I'll call Dave. So Dave was a pretty cool guy, just the average elder you would find in any rural town. He liked to drink wine with his friends at the bar, go hunting, and he had a lot of good and interesting stories to tell me when I was a kid, and after all these years spent together, he basically considered me as a grandson. Now back when COVID hit for the first time in my country, I had a dream one night where Mary was coming to my house to clean as every other week, but this time in my living room there was a closed black coffin. When I asked her what was in there, she looked at me and said in a sad tone, "Dave is inside there." Now if that wasn't strange enough, I remember waking up later that night and feeling a presence to the side of my bed, and I distinctly remember to have said while still being half asleep, "Come on Dave, let me get back to sleep." Next morning when I woke, my parents told me that Mary had called saying that Dave had passed that night due to COVID complication. To this day I still haven't told anyone about it, and I am still a bit freaked out from the whole story. Also sorry for format and grammar, but I'm on mobile and English isn't my first language.
4 years ago my daughter walked into my room while my wife and I were asleep. She nudged me and said, "Dad isn't breathing." I was like, "Honey, I'm fine, I'm right here and I'm okay." She replied with, "He won't wake up." "Why won't Dad wake up?" I said, "Honey, I'm awake and I'm talking to you." She then turns around and goes back to bed. I look at the clock and it's 2:11 a.m. My wife says, "What's that about?" I said, "I don't know," and we go back to sleep. The next morning we're all at work just talking and getting ready for the day at 8ish, and my boss comes over and informs us that one of our co-workers passed in the night. We're talking about this and we ask how and when. My boss then tells us he died from a heart attack at around 2 a.m. is what they told his wife. I have to sit down and recollect to when my daughter came into our room saying everything she did. At the time he was remodeling his new home and his wife was staying at her mom's house. His daughter was staying with him as her school was closer to the new home and he could drop her off before coming to work. My daughter and his daughter became good friends from playing softball together. All I could think of was my daughter was acting out what his daughter was saying and trying to wake him up at that time. My daughter was 5 at the time and his daughter was sleeping in the bed with him due to it being a new house and being a little scary at the time. I still think about that today, but my daughter has no recollection of ever coming in the room that night. My daughter and her remain friends, but she no longer plays softball as that was their thing. She seems to be doing better after counseling and being the one that found him that night. My wife and his wife have remained friends too, and she still struggles with it. Their son on the other hand has had severe problems and refused counseling. But he is working and got a scholarship to swim in college. On the outside he seems fine, but I know things are still bottled up and hope he does finally seek closure with it.
When my daughter was about 10, she joined a softball league and Dad, taught her how to throw, hit, etc. I took her to a local Class AAA minor league game. I had never been to this stadium before, 16,000 seats, and had ordered tickets online. The seats I got were down the third baseline, about as far away from home plate as you can get and still be in the stadium. Important. As the game progresses, she sees foul balls going into the stands and after a while asks if you can keep one if you catch it. I told her yes, and she said, "Catch me one, Daddy." I spent a few minutes explaining to her why that was very unlikely to happen where we were. As I'm finishing breaking her heart, I hear a bat crack, look up, and see a long, towering fly ball, and knew immediately from my years playing baseball that this one was coming to me. All I had to do was stand up, raise my glove hand to my right ear, I'm a lefty, and that ball smacked perfectly in the webbing. The crowd cheered. 25 years later, I still have the memory of my daughter's face as I gave it to her. When I think about all the factors that had to come together for that to happen, a lefty batter, the right pitch and swing, the badly selected seating, that I even found and brought my old glove, it affirmed my belief that there is a higher power who sometimes grants small miracles. Edited typo, it was a AAA team, one step below the majors. I doubt there's a single A team in the country that plays in this large a stadium.
My granddad died when I was 7, but, per his own words, I was his absolute favorite, partially because I am the splitting image of his mother, even into adulthood. When I was 21, I was set to give birth to my first son. I was about to get into the elevator to L&D when a man came in saying that he a volunteer and he'd help me and my husband find our way. The elevator was slow, but we spent the time talking about what a blessing children are and how they grow up so fast. Here's the thing, he looked and sounded exactly like my granddad, same stature, same blue-gray eyes, same faint Scottish-Canadian accent, same khakis, checked shirt, and sky blue cardigan. Even spookier is that the nurses said they don't have any older male volunteers in that particular building. I don't really believe in ghosts, but I am absolutely certain Granddad paid me a visit that night. I'm a physician and my former medical assistant had quite a few different stories, but one of them was that she had a child that was about 5 or 6 or so who got quite sick. She took her to the hospital, and apparently they couldn't figure out what was wrong. Some young doctor came in and basically said to her, "They aren't going to find out what's wrong here, you have to go to XYZ hospital and they'll make the correct diagnosis there and help her get better." She apparently heeded the advice, and transferred her daughter, and lo and behold they did make some rare diagnosis or whatever and started the appropriate treatment. My ma went back to try and find this doctor to thank him, and she asked around and nobody knew anything about him. Apparently he didn't exist. Then later, at the new hospital, she was praying in the chapel, she's a devout Christian, and he came in. They talked a bit, she thanked him, and then he left and she never saw him again. However, at some point she mentioned this doctor to her daughter, and her daughter perked up or whatever and said she knew who he was. Apparently her daughter described him identically, although my ma had never brought him up to her before. He apparently would come in and sit with her sometimes. I guess the daughter kept seeing him sometimes for years, though later it was only if she was getting anesthesia, and then she would see him shortly beforehand or something like that. My ma, understandably I think, considers that he was an angel. That's not the only story I've heard reminiscent of that one, but I think that's maybe the best one.
When I was going to my family's home I got in a SUV going down the road. This was in Bangladesh at the time, and after taking the SUV the next 2 hours would be a highway going down a forest. I was sitting shotgun and along the highway there was an old man walking down the highway. He was hitchhiking and the driver decided to pick him up. He insisted on sitting in my seat and obliged as he was an older man. About an hour down the drive our car collided with a bus and the shotgun seat was mangled up. We all got out and we looked around but we couldn't find the old man that insisted on taking my seat anywhere. Stories like these aren't rare but I didn't believe them. We all know the man sat in my seat and we all saw him. But he was nowhere to be found. Edit, he just vanished. No blood. He was wearing ethnic attire which isn't peculiar around that area. He didn't speak at all, and we didn't ask him anything either. He just said to drop him off at the market ahead which would be in the town my house was in. One thing that was weird was that he spoke in an oldish Bengali. Like a old Bengali that we'd see in poetry from the 1800s. I didn't see it as peculiar cause he seemed like an ascetic. Second edit, I have pics of the collision if you guys were wondering. Third edit, when I said he didn't speak at all I meant during the ride, he didn't say anything other than where he wanted to go and insisting on my seat.
I've had a really similar thing happen, though I didn't get pushed down the stairs. When I was 18-19 and still adjusting to life after high school, I remember being really lonely because all my friends had moved away to go to college and I was the only one who stayed in our hometown and went to community college, so I was also dealing with feeling less than because I didn't go to university right after high school. Definitely don't regret it now though. I remember just wishing that I had a companion or a friend who would just be with me when I was feeling especially sad or lonely, and every time I had that thought, I would feel a hand. It would be on my shoulder or my back, occasionally my lower back and even my thigh once or twice, but there was definitely something there. I could feel the weight and the warmth of it. It wasn't really scary after the first few times, I got used to it eventually. It also didn't feel malicious. It just felt like someone standing next to / behind me putting their hand on me to comfort me. I always felt a little better, like I wasn't alone and everything was going to be okay. Eventually I made some new friends and the loneliness went away, and eventually so did the hands. I can still feel them occasionally when I'm driving alone at night and start to get creeped out by the dark and scary roads, or when I start to feel nervous about moving out of my childhood home next month. Sometimes I think it might be my great-grandpa, who died when I was 5 and is the only person I've known who has died, but I also like to think it could be someone who was just like me at some point and is just trying to comfort me in the way they wanted to be comforted when they were in my shoes.
A little late, but here goes. When I was in middle school, my grandparents were in charge of the local theater group and we're doing this musical show where people dressed up as old country stars and sang some songs. My grandma was the director and my grandpa was in charge of technical stuff like lights and sound. Well, this particular showing was on Elvis Presley's birthday and they had a little bit at the end where they sang happy birthday in all their costumes. Well, the show ends and they're all doing curtain call and I'm sitting in the back with my grandpa while he's controlling the lights and sound when all of a sudden Happy Birthday by the Beatles starts playing over the speakers. My grandpa looks confused and starts messing around with the sound machines and pressing buttons and dials, and my grandma runs back yelling at him as that wasn't the song he was supposed to play. He then looks up and goes, "That's not me," and my grandma says, "What do you mean it's not you? Switch it to the right song," and he looks so confused and says, "We don't even have this song on CD for this play. This isn't coming from our music," and my grandma just turns around and leaves. Whole song plays and ends when the curtain closes. No one in the crowd really noticed and it seemed normal, but still freaks me out. No clue where the music was coming from, and we inspected the CD that all the music for the play was on that was currently in the computer playing music throughout the entire performance, and sure enough that song was not on it. I still think the ghost of Elvis was there that night, lol.
Woke up one in the middle of the night to a man standing next to the bed staring at my so. He was slightly translucent and I figured it was just another sleep paralysis episode, had them before so knew the drill, and rolled over and went to go back to sleep. Normally being able to move isn't part of sleep paralysis, and immediately my heart began to race as I realized I need to roll over and check what I saw. Person was still standing there, staring at my so, then he made eye contact with me. Stared at me for a while before turning around and walking to the wall, slowly fading away with each step. Next morning So wakes up looking like shit and said she had the worst night's sleep because she kept having the feeling that someone was watching her. Glad we no longer live in that house.
In high school, I was getting peer pressured into doing something I didn't want to do, and would have gotten in a lot of trouble had a teacher come by, but I felt I didn't have a choice. I distinctly remember asking in my head, "If I have a guardian angel right now, please fucking pull the fire alarm or something." I kid you not, at that exact second, the fire alarm went off. This never happened at this school. It was so unlikely, I didn't expect it to actually happen. Nearly shit my pants. We immediately went to the assembly area along with the rest of the school, and I got out of the situation. Turns out at that moment someone in the school had accidentally triggered the fire alarm. I spent the rest of the day in shock, honestly. I don't know if this counts as supernatural, but what even are the chances? That day introduced me to the idea of guardian angels, and I have had many similar occasions since then where just in the nick of time, I've gotten out of potentially extremely bad situations either due to insane luck, or the nudge of something looking out for me. Edit. The thing I didn't want to do was that my friends wanted to smoke up. I had strict parents and the school had very strict drug policies, immediate expulsion. Also, I had never done a drug before and was scared and very uncomfortable. I wish it was something cooler and less lame.
I had a dream at age 9 where I was walking through an alleyway with another boy, who I didn't know at the time, having a conversation about school grades or something. 2 years later I meet this boy, and turns out he's a friend of my brother who's a year older than me, but it still didn't hit me yet that he was the one I was walking with in my dream. Another 3 years pass, we are now in high school, and all three of us are walking through the usual alleyway that we passed through to get home. Then a conversation about school grades pop up and I get hit with the biggest realization and feeling of déjà vu ever. I was reliving the dream that occurred 5 years prior and my memory of that dream became very vivid at that moment. They thought I was a MF wizard predicting what they were gonna say a second before they speak. This happened 8 months ago, it was great.
Woke up, needed to pee, went back to my room and there was a thing next to my bed. I remember it was very dark and spindly, shaped almost like Gollum, and its legs bent backwards and it seemed to have wisps of shadow coming off of it. I just stared at it for a few seconds before a woman's voice told me, "This isn't for you to see, you should go get a glass of water." So I turned my ass around and went to get a glass of water. I was in the kitchen, now awake enough to think it through, and convinced myself that it was our black fluffy cat. But then when I went back to my room and saw that my parents' door was closed, and remembered that they'd taken that cat in with them. I also remembered that I've seen that cat in the darkness before, and it doesn't look like weird Gollum, it looks like a bowling ball with stub feet. So then I assumed I just dreamed it. Well, when I got back to my room, the book that I'd been reading before bed and had left on the pillow next to me was sitting in the middle of my bedroom floor. I've told this story before on Reddit and someone told me that they've seen the Gollum critter too. I believe they said it was under their bed and that it had a lot of teeth.
Apparently we lived with a benign spirit in our house for 3.5 years. This is my mother's account of what happened because my sister and I didn't see anything at the time. Only my brother, his best friend and my mother saw it. Back when we were living in South Africa we had moved into an apartment which we had bought. The moving in was actually quite eventful because a mother and her son were renting the place before and although they had been notified they decided to stay past the date that was given to them. I'm not really sure about the details to that as I was around 7 or 8. Long story short we moved in and started settling. After putting us to bed my mother decided to stay up and watch TV. My brother was out with his friends. As she's watching whatever show was on at the time she glances to our only plant in the house, which is about a 1.5 m tall and sees a man roughly the same height as the plant standing under one of its leaves. Noping out of that shit she gets up and flicks the lights on. He's not there. Calling it a night she goes to bed. The next day, or maybe 2 days later, I'm not sure on that detail, at breakfast my brother, who was around 16 at the time, picked up a piece of bread, turned around to the plant and said, "Hey Michael. Want some?" laughing. My mother asks him who Michael is and he says Michael's the guy standing under the plant at night. Mind you, my mother didn't say anything to anyone about Michael to not freak us out. My brother's best friend was also over that morning, we had basically unofficially adopted him, and my mother asks him if he sees Michael too and he says yes. She then asks him to describe Michael and he gives a perfect description down to the whites of his eyes. Michael apparently was a black young man around 1.40/50 m in height wearing plain black trousers, a white button-down shirt, and a green vest. His skin tone was quite dark with a faint sheen to it. His eyes were also dark in volar and the whites were tinted a bit yellow. He had a permanent smiling expression on his face that didn't reach his eyes. He stayed put where he was, never moving but following you with his eyes. One morning my mom woke up to my dad coming home who had bought this indoor circulating water thing, I really don't know what they're called. He moved the plant exactly opposite where it was, next to the couch and put that water thing there instead. My mother didn't say anything and that night Michael also moved with the plant. Of course after hearing this I asked the next logical question that any sane person would ask. Why the fuck didn't she just throw away the plant? She said it never occurred to her facepalm. So yeah, that is the story of Michael, the benign smiling spirit that was a part of our family for some time. Edit. I had drawn the basic layout of our living room, but it looked completely fucked up when posted. So I erased it. Oh well. Edit 2. Just spoke to my mother. She said Michael's eyes weren't dark but a dark honey color. How I forgot such a creepy detail is beyond me. But there you have it.
Red luminescent ball flying on the horizon. It moved like nothing we'd ever seen, zipping around at incredible speed that defied the laws of physics. There were about 20 of us watching it, and some of the kids asked me what I thought it was, as I grew up living and breathing aviation with my dad. I had to tell them that since I couldn't identify what it was, that it was essentially a UFO. Had to then explain that it doesn't mean aliens, just that what we saw couldn't be identified by any knowledge I had of aircraft, not then, and not even now. It could have been ball lighting for all I knew at the time, but it was kilometers away above the horizon in the dusk sunlight.
It was a bright afternoon and I was home alone, getting ready for my brother's hockey game. As I was finishing up in the bathroom mirror, I saw something inexplicable to my left in my brother's room. The figure of a tall, lanky man easily 7 feet appeared at the side of my brother's bed and swiftly walked to the other side of the room, out of my line of sight. I could only perceive the figure's silhouette and identified a wide-brimmed fedora and a long nose. Otherwise, he was completely pitch black. Void of light, the blackest black I have ever perceived. Confused, I walked into my brother's room, questioning whether I was really home alone. Of course, no one was there. I felt that sinking feeling in my stomach and asked my brother later that night if he ever saw someone in his room. He said no, but he's not the kind of person to admit to seeing a ghost, to be honest. Months later I told a friend about what I saw and she said, "Oh, that's the Hat Man. People all over the world have seen him." I looked it up on Google Images and yes, it was the Hat Man. Edit. Bonus story. I was probably 12 to 13 and woke up in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom. There was snow on the ground and a little bit of moonlight, so I didn't need to turn on the lights to see where I was going. As I came back to the door of my room, I froze. I can't quite explain it, but it's like some deep part of my brain was screaming and refused to send the signals to my body to move. I couldn't logic my way out of it. I was just stuck at my door frame, looking into my room. On the other side of the room, sitting on my windowsill, were the 2 Amish dolls my grandma had given me a few years before. Amish dolls are stuffed soft cloth dolls in Amish clothing and no faces. My eyes snapped to the female doll and I couldn't look away from her. She was bathed in moonglow and clearly visible, even with the lights off. I have no idea how long I looked at her, frozen, maybe 2 minutes, maybe 45 minutes. Time stopped. Then, she slowly raised her right arm up above her head, then slowly down, back into its resting position. When I could finally move again, I don't remember if I worked up the courage to go back to my bed or if I slept on the couch, but I did ask my dad to take the dolls away the next day. This is a long story. I got my driver's license at 22 years old and was a nervous driver. One summer in 2014, my parents were going to our family's beach house with my at the time toddler son, and I was going to meet them there the following Saturday morning as I had work. At the time I was driving a beat-up 2000 Chevy Cavalier with no air conditioning, and my cigarette lighter was broken, so I could not charge my GPS system in the car. I also didn't have a smartphone at the time, so I figured I would charge my GPS overnight and it would survive the hour-and-a-half drive to my family's beach house. What I didn't take into account, due to being a freshly licensed driver, was that Saturday morning traffic on the New Jersey Garden State Parkway in the summer is a fucking nightmare. I also have an absolutely awful sense of direction and I can get a bit anxious when I get lost. I left my house around 8 in the morning and texted my parents that I would be at the beach house around 10 o'clock latest, and that I would take the baby to the beach when I got there. By 10:45 I was sitting in dead stop of traffic, sweating my butt off as there was no breeze. The GPS suggested I take a different exit than I normally would, and I jumped at the chance to get off the parkway. Whatever exit it wanted me to take also brought me to more dead stop traffic. At this point, my GPS was about to die and I had no idea where I was going. I didn't even have a bottle of water on me. Around 12:30, I was driving through random towns with no idea where I was, covered in sweat. My GPS had been dead for hours and I was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. I called my parents, who had no idea where I was, and they suggested I stop somewhere to ask for directions, but when I did find a fire station, no one was inside. I went back to my car utterly defeated and burst into tears. I didn't know what to do, and was half afraid I would never find my way home. I thought of my late uncle, who was a limo driver and the namesake of my son. I was sure he probably knew exactly where I was due to taking teenagers down the shore every year after their proms. I looked up at the ceiling of my car and cried, "Hey, Uncle C, I'm lost and afraid and I have to get to the baby. Where the hell am I?" All of a sudden, I heard the mechanical voice of the GPS say at the stop sign, "Make a right." I looked down at the GPS and saw that it was no longer dead, but it wasn't fully on either. Instead of it showing a map or the main menu, it was just a blank white screen. It repeated to me, at the stop sign, "Make a right." I figured I had maybe a minute or so before it died again, so I went to the stop sign and made the right. The GPS directed me for the next half an hour to the front of my family's beach house. As soon as I parked the car, instead of the typical "you have reached your destination" that the GPS usually said, it just went, "Goodbye," and then died again. I had never heard it say goodbye to me before that day, and I never heard it say that again. My family and I are convinced that my uncle helped me find my way home through the GPS. And yes, I got a smartphone that same year for Christmas, so I would always have access to a GPS, lol.
When I was 17, I was at my friend's apartment building, which his parents owned. It was a pretty old building in the Pilsen neighborhood of Chicago, and according to his dad it used to be owned by Al Capone, but I'm not sure how true that was. We had an apartment on the top floor that they let us use to just hang out, and it allowed us easy access to the attic. It had a lock on the door, but we had a key, so we could go out to the roof and smoke cigarettes. One night, we were about to go up, but I had to pee, so I told him I'd meet him up there. After I was done, I went up the stairs to the attic portion that was connected to the roof. There were no lights, so we always used our phones to guide us. We had those old flip phones without lights, so you only had the light from the screen to help navigate the cluttered mess that was up there. As I made my way to the roof door, I saw a shadow pass by me. Now this wasn't like the shadow of something moving with the light of my phone. This shadow felt solid like a person. I followed the direction it went, thinking it was my friend. I kept saying that I knew it was him and to stop playing around. It passed me a few more times, before heading to the other side of the attic, and that's when I heard my friend's voice from downstairs. He got a call from his girlfriend and was in another room talking to her the whole time. It really freaked me out, since I know I was following something, so I basically jumped down the stairs. I told my friend what happened and that I did not want to go back up there, and he agreed, so we decided to go for a walk instead. Earlier this year, his brother tells us in our group text that he found out the building's designer killed himself in that attic.
Yeah, I've got one of these back from when I went on holiday with my, then, wife and young son. We went to this place in Sicily, a small island just off of Italy. Sicily has got quite a rich history, and we stayed in some modernized accommodation around there, but we were told the building was once an older building circa the Muslim years, 800/900 AD-ish. So my wife wanted to get away a bit because she had been dealing with a very difficult 2-year-old for the past 4 months, and this was her chance to relax. She went off to see the sights, went to some bars, etc. My son was fussy, so I stayed with him. The hotel we stayed in was eerie and my son could not settle, so we went out for a while. When I got back, my wife was on the bed already changed. I settled my boy and lay down while my wife still sat there. She had drunk quite a bit during the day and I could tell as she swayed. She looked like she had seen a ghost. When I asked her if she was okay, she swears she could hear a faint shuffling and groaning in the hotel. I joked about whether it was a zombie. Then I heard it. Almost like a gasp and faint murmur. It wasn't my son as he was now resting, besides, it was too deep for a toddler to make. My wife was terrified, so I went to investigate, and the hotel staff told me about the history of war in the area and that sometimes people do hear things in the walls and around the rooms. For the rest of the week, we never heard anything again, but I will always remember that murmur which felt like it was in the room with us. Pretty sure we had an otherworldly experience that day.
As a kid, I used to spend the night at a friend's house, around 12 to 13. We decided to go out, do some ding-dong ditching, and engage in some adolescent angsty debauchery because our parents were not at home. It's around 1 or 2 a.m. when we arrive home. The doorbell rings, and we immediately assume it's the authorities or an enraged neighbor. My friend had a small window on the front porch that you couldn't see into from the street, so we peeked in to see who was calling at such a late hour. An elderly woman dressed in a gown and a small child dressed in a strange newsy attire stood at the door. Because it was the 1990s, they were both dressed extremely out of period. My acquaintance had never seen any of them before in the neighborhood. We duck because we're a little startled, then look again in less than 10 seconds and they've both vanished. They vanished without a trace, with no one on the street walking away or automobiles driving away. We didn't get much sleep.
As background, I was a duty officer in the White House Situation Room some years ago. I did an AMA about it a few years ago if you want to read more. It's a pretty well-known fact that the White House is haunted. And I know someone who has seen an actual ghost there. No bamboozle. There is a hallway that I informally called the Lincoln Hallway. I'm not sure what its official name is. But I called it that because it had lots of Lincoln-related stuff like this painting of the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation, a bust of Lincoln, and a couple of other things. So this one night shift, it's about 3 a.m., and my team chief says he is going to go walk around and stretch his legs. He leaves and comes back about 10 minutes later, his face completely drained of all color. Before I go on, it is important to establish something. This guy had precisely zero sense of humor. None. He had gone to a service academy and was as uptight and by the book as they come. Don't get me wrong, he's a good dude but extremely serious. We see him and we're like, "Hey man, you okay? What happened?" And he just keeps saying, "I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to talk about it." At this point we're concerned. Like, was he sexually harassed by a Secret Service agent or something? None of this is making any sense. None at all. About an hour goes by and he finally says, "I saw something." We waited and he said, "I was walking in the hallway, you know, where all the stuff of Lincoln is. And I saw someone." Okay. I think it was a kid. He was only probably about 4 feet tall, and he was just there in the hallway, looking at that bust of Lincoln. We asked what happened then, and he said he kind of looked around to make sure he wasn't crazy, and when he looked back, the boy was gone. Willie Lincoln was the third son of Abraham Lincoln. He died in the White House in 1862.
Till this day I have no idea what happened. When my son was 2.5 years old, there was a period of time that for like a week he would wake up every single night at 1:55 a.m. screaming, crying and yelling for about a minute before going back to sleep again. Me and my wife brushed it off at the beginning, that's until we noticed that every single time it happened, it was at the same hour, 1:55. So, naturally, we started to check up on him every time, but nothing. He was just sleeping pretty peacefully. One morning I finally asked him if he remembered waking up screaming and yelling that night. He told me that he, in fact, did remember. So I asked him what's up, and for a moment a glaze of terror flashed his face. "It's because the old, scary gray man, Daddy. He has glowing red eyes and he is trying to grab me while screaming. He then processed to eat his banana as if we had a small talk about the weather. Well, that night, he slept with us. And while my wife and son were sleeping peacefully, I was wide awake, only to hear, at exactly 1:55 a.m., what sounded like a loud shouts of an old man. A shout that lasted for about 3 seconds. I got up and ran to my son's room and found nothing. About 2 days later everything got back to normal. Was it just nightmares my son had? Maybe. I have no reasonable explanation.
I've told these stories on an account I used to have that I can't for the life of me remember how to log into. When I was an older teenager, everyone in the house had just gone to sleep. It was around midnight, and me and my sister always slept with our bedroom door open. I had a clear view of the kitchen table from my bedroom since it was the first bedroom leading away from the living room, but all the lights were off and it was pitch black so I couldn't see anything. As I drifted off to sleep, the clear, unmistakable sound of a kitchen chair sliding loudly across the kitchen floor jolted me awake. I was terrified to look into the kitchen from my bed. My dad got up right away and came down the hall in his tighty-whities and turned the lights on to investigate. Think Harry, beer belly blue collar redneck, and there was no one in the kitchen. We were all in bed, including the dogs. The sound woke everyone up. All we could really do was go back to sleep and hope the rest of the night was quiet. Another time in the same house, I was going into the kitchen, again close to midnight, to put a glass in the sink. There was a window above the sink that had one of those solid, pull-down blind shades. As I got to the sink, the blind suddenly went flying up and rolled up into itself. I flew out of the kitchen at lightning speed. Once when my boyfriend was leaving to go home when I was around 20 or 21, again, around midnight, we tiptoed to the front door in the darkness and I was telling him bye, and the disc tray in the DVD player in the living room opened and closed a few times by itself while we both stood there wide-eyed and staring at it. He was like, "Well, gotta go," and left, and I sprinted back to my room. I'm fully convinced the house has something bad in it, and it always felt very evil. I lived there from the time I was 10 until I was 23. I used to have horrific nightmares about something evil being in the walk-in closet of the master bedroom. In my dreams it was always a big black shadow/mass that was trying to drag me into the closet, and I would be frantically trying to escape it in slow motion. Or it would be hovering near the foot of my bed slowly inching towards me. The terror I felt in those dreams was always so real. And I couldn't stand to be in or near that closet for more than a few minutes at a time. I always had the overwhelming feeling to run if I was around it for too long. I had to start sleeping with a lamp on when I got to be around 19 because I was always sleeping in a state of fright, and to this day at 31 I'm scared to sleep alone in complete darkness. But the dreams basically stopped when I moved out. Neither of my parents could stand to sleep in the master bedroom for longer than a few months at a time. My dad swears that one night while he was sleeping in there alone, my mom had started sleeping in the living room at that point, that he felt the blankets tug on one side of him, so when he rolled over to see what it was he heard a voice in his ear on the other side whisper, "Liar. Liar. Liar." He did not spend the rest of the night in there. Years later my parents gave sleeping in there another try for a few months, and my baby niece was living with us. There was a crib for her at the foot of my parents' bed, and my dad said he woke up and saw the shape of my niece sitting up in her crib in the darkness, and he went to nudge my mom awake to tell her to get the baby, but my mom had already taken my niece into the living room and neither of them were in the room. My dad basically hightailed it out of there and the baby-shaped shadow was gone. My brother claims that he had a sleep paralysis episode of something sitting on his chest and strangling him. Which was odd to me, because I remember when we first moved into the house I briefly slept in my brother's room, and I had the most peaceful dream at 10 years old that I was in a beautiful, sunny, and very green forest, and there was an intense feeling of peace washing over me. And in my dream I had the understanding that God was with me and that everything was okay. I used to hang out in my brother's room and play video games with him, and not once was I ever spooked or afraid in there. Now only my dad lives in the house, my parents are separated, and he sleeps in the literal diagonal opposite end of the house from the master bedroom closet. He turned the den right by the front door into his bedroom, and his bed is in the farthest corner of the room. He spends all his time at home reading the Bible and making his own ammo. My boyfriend, same one, jokes around every now and then that maybe my dad will give us the house one day, and my response is always heck no. I don't want to live there. It's haunted.
I worked third shift in the emergency room. When a baby was born, a little chime would play over the hospital speakers. I think it was Rock-a-Bye Baby. One night a man was driven in by car. It was an OD and he was unconscious. The nurses and docs were doing CPR on the stretcher on the way to the trauma room. Sadly he passed away. The second that the doc called time of death, all the lights in the emergency room went out, the backup generator came on and Rock-a-Bye Baby played immediately after the generator kicked in. This all took less than a minute. To this day I still remember the chills I got that night. Whatever it was so freaky. The second was when my spouse and I were looking to buy a house. We pulled up with the realtor and I immediately did not want to go in that house. It felt wrong. Well, we went in anyway. The second we got in, I felt like I was trespassing and wanted to leave. We walked through the house and the realtor opens the door to the basement and turned on the light. As soon as the light came on, I saw a black shadow run. We both saw it and thought it was my spouse, so we went down. All the strings that you pull to turn the lights on and off were tied like nooses. It was creepy as all get out. My spouse came down the stairs and I asked them what they were doing upstairs since we both thought they were down in the basement. Spouse said they were in the garage and was not in the basement. Right as we were leaving the basement, something pushed me. I felt the hand on my back and everything. As soon as we left we both said that house was haunted. That night spouse and I both had the same nightmare about an old lady in black and with frizzy hair. The nightmares lasted about a week for both of us. I am not religious, but the only thing that got rid of this old lady was saying the Our Father prayer over and over again. It still scares the crap out of me to this day. I don't even drive on that street, that is how scared I am of that house.
While working at the City Tavern in Old City, Philadelphia, considered to be one of the most haunted buildings in the US. Have seen full dinner service, plates, utensils, glasses, and all fly off the table we called Big Round in the middle of dinner service. Not sorta topple over, but full on suicide yeet off the table. Personally I have witnessed this occur twice, with one of the times being a slower dinner service with nobody seated at the round, but it happened often enough that every server, and even a few customers came to expect it from time to time. I'm sure there is a logical explanation for it occurring, maybe a really specific vibration from the subway was my best guess. Except the train doesn't go below the historic district. When opening, the building would sometimes sound like many people were in it, even when we knew it was only a few of us there. Place is huge, and lots of stairwells dumbwaiters, so I guess it's a trick of acoustics. Weird icy drafts out nowhere, shifting furniture, etc. Every haunted house cliché seems to just naturally occur in the place. Ask anyone who ever worked there, the place is straight up spooky at times. Sadly, Chef Walter Stabe, the last proprietor, had to close the place due to COVID-19 and will not be reopening. This is only the second time the place has closed in its 250-year history.
The thing that happened to me has stuck with me every single night for the past 28 years and happened when I was 5. There has not been one night in that amount of time that I haven't thought about it. My younger brother and I shared a bunk bed. I was on the top bunk. I woke up one night having to pee. I sit up and throw off my covers, so this wasn't sleep paralysis, I was actively awake and moving. At the end of the bed I noticed something standing there. All I see is this thing staring at me. Its head was very large and spanned the width of the bunk bed, oval in shape with 2 little yellow glowing eyes. I'm guessing it was around 6 feet tall, had dark skin and a thin neck. It was standing there just staring at me. I stared back at it for a few seconds before I did what any little kid would do, hide under the covers. I laid there for I don't know how long, panicking. I could still feel it staring at me and eventually fell back asleep sometime later. In the morning it's the first thing I told my mom and she still remembers me doing that to this day. I had a lot of nightmares about it for a while afterwards. Here is a drawing I made a few years ago. What's funny is that I might have seen another one of these things prior to that when I was 3 or 4. I remember running upstairs to get my star shoes, Converse, and the hallway light was on, barely illuminating my parents' bedroom. As soon as I reach the top of the steps I look over and see half a figure in motion walking into my parents' closet. It was tall, lanky, and thin, with yellowish skin. Didn't see the head so I couldn't say whether or not it was the same thing. I ran back downstairs after that,